Good morning. All right, today we're going to read Daniel 6 verses, well, I guess all of them. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished among all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set over him the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber, opened toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O King Darius, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" The king answered and said, "The thing stands, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they answered and said before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed." Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at daybreak the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Kids are dismissed at this time.
Steve. Check, 1, 2. We on? Yeah, I think we're on. Great. Good morning, Lake Taps. Let me begin with a story. I'll set the backdrop for what we're going to look at this morning. And the story is it's a story of a conversation that took place at the pearly gates. So it's a completely true story. It's a story between a guy who he comes to the pearly gates. He sees St. Peter there, and Peter looks at the guy and he says, "You're early, clearly early." And the guy says, "Yeah, I know I'm early. I asked for help, and no one helped me." And he said, "Well, hold on. You had a flood at your house take place, right?" He said, "Yeah, I had a flood. My whole house was flooded. I cried to God for help, and He didn't help me." Peter looks at the guy and he says, "Well, what about the police department? Because we sent the police department out to help you. And the guy looks and says, 'Yeah, well, there was a raft that came by. The police department came, but I said to them, look, God's going to help me. I don't need your help. God's going to help me.'" And so Peter's getting a bit indignant. He's also puzzled, and he looks and says, "Okay, well, what about the fire department? Because we sent the fire department too to help you out. Sort of the last call." And the guy looks and says, "Yeah, well, I saw the fire department, but I said to them too, like I asked, I don't need your help. I asked God for help. He's going to help me." So now Peter's really upset. And he says, "Okay, but the Coast Guard, we sent the Coast Guard to help you. Like search and rescue. How did you respond there?" And slowly, this guy's connecting the dots. That actually, in his cry for help, God was helping him, but he wasn't able to identify how God was actually helping him. As we look at this story of Daniel 6 this morning, and as we've actually been building and working and exploring this book of Daniel, we're now, I think, in the 7th sermon and looking at chapter 6 this morning. Clearly we see pretty clear and demonstrative signs of God working, acting, speaking, calling out, delivering in this story, rescuing, saving. But really the question that I want to zero in on as we walk through this passage this morning is if God is involved in this world, which by the way, that's a fundamental truth that emerges in this story, in really the whole of Daniel, that God actually is involved. But if God is involved in this world, how is He working and where is He working? That's the question we're going to look at. We're going to come back to that, but we're going to walk through this passage almost a blow by blow and then come back to that question. If God is involved in this world, how does He work and where does He work? First, let me come back to a couple really important contextual points. Something we haven't discussed too much in this series is the purpose for this book. What was the occasion? And often, especially in the New Testament, that's almost like a go-to, like in terms of understanding the book and understanding the author and just understanding how the original listeners would have heard a story. That's immediately almost what we go to. Hey, how do the original listeners interpret this? In this case, it's important to remember, and maybe for us, not remember, but to just understand, that this book was written to Israelites in exile. The book of Daniel was written to exiles, to Israelites who actually, to say hopeless is like an understatement. They had no hope. Hope was not even like in the same stratosphere. They were being persecuted. They were under oppression, and they were in the grips of their oppressor, so to speak. So Daniel is almost like a guide to hope for those people, saying, "Hey, this is why. This is how you can hope." So that's an important piece. That's going to help us make sense of the book, and especially as we move on to chapter 7, because it gets pretty hairy. It's pretty hairy starting in chapter 7. We're going to get into that. But that's going to help us make sense of how the original listeners would have interpreted this, because Daniel is in exile, and he's almost giving them a template as to how can you have faith in a strange land. A really quick anecdote that I mentioned briefly last week is that Daniel is now in his 80s. He's not a young puppy anymore. He actually is this well-aged sage, really. He's battle tested. We see him in chapter 1 when he's really a teenager, and now he's seen a lot. He's been through a lot, and that's an encouraging point. Just a really quick footnote, because often in the scriptures we talk to the young, and we'll say, "Hey, look, you're never too young." Well, actually, Daniel tells us you're never too old. If you feel as though actually you've already peaked, Daniel tells you maybe not. He was on the sunny side of 80, and he was still actually going strong. Pretty interesting stuff there. So we're looking at living with strong faith in a strange land, and we mentioned last week that's a double entendre. It's not only Daniel, how do we live with strong faith in a strange land, according to Daniel, but for those of us here today who actually feel as though we are in exile, we're in a strange land. Faith is, the faith that we have in Jesus is not necessarily encouraged. It's almost we have this homelessness feeling about our faith. Daniel speaks to not only exiles in that time, but actually for those of us today who feels that we are in exile. So we're going to look at that question. If God is involved in our world, how does he work and where does he work? Let me pray. Father, in these next few moments, help us to hear your voice. Help us to be attentive to, Lord, what you are doing, how you are working, how you are speaking to us, what you might want to say to us in these few moments. Lord, change us, mold us, shape us, and let these next few minutes be a means by which the Spirit of Jesus meets with us and brings us closer and gives us a bigger picture of you, and that providing a means by which we can live more faithfully for you. In Christ's name, amen. So we begin in verse 1. And we see in verse 1, it pleased Darius, this man named Darius, to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. Now let's just stop there for a moment, because it's worth sort of figuring out who is this guy named Darius. We saw even in the last chapter, 5th chapter of Daniel, all of a sudden we see this guy called Belshazzar, who we hadn't actually, there was no cue, there was no preface to that. All of a sudden you just see Belshazzar. Up to that point, it was Nebuchadnezzar, and then what we know also from history is there actually were several kings and rulers between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, but it's a bit abrupt in chapter 5. Same kind of idea in actually chapter 6. It's abrupt. We don't have no background to who Darius is. He's a ruler, and from history, actually, we don't have a lot to work off. There's actually very little that we know about this man named Darius. That's not really what I want to focus on. What I do want to focus on, just in terms of the context details here, is that Daniel's now serving under new rule. It's not Babylonian power anymore. It's a Medo-Persian rule. And even this man named Darius is working under Cyrus, who we actually do have a fair bit of information historically. But the key gleaning is that there's a new master in Babylon. Daniel is serving under the Medo-Persian rule. We're going to touch on it very briefly because I don't want to get into the weeds of it. But we also will notice that there's a different kind of monarchy. Nebuchadnezzar functioned more or less under an absolute monarchy, and someone would say he sort of was above the law. If you wanted someone killed, got it done. If you wanted someone spared, you got that done. Whereas actually what we see develop, there's a lot of complexity. There are layers of complexity to how law works in the Medo-Persian Empire. So it's not an absolute monarchy anymore. It's a constitutional monarchy. And that's going to play into how the story develops here. So Daniel is an advisor. He's working still in public policy. He's distinguished in that category with his colleagues. And eventually what happens is news leaks out. It's almost like a Washington, D.C. kind of narrative. News leaks. There's a leak that happens where people find out that the king, the ruler, wants to promote Daniel. And this is no ordinary promotion. Darius wants to set him over the whole kingdom. And Daniel's colleagues, they don't like this. They might not even like Daniel. They don't like this kind of idea, so they conspire against him. And they look to spy on him. And what's interesting is if you just think about that, they're in public policy, and they've got a lot of info. They know how to get intel, do the reconnaissance. They know how to do that, yet they can't find anything on him. They cannot dig up any dirt on Daniel, which is actually quite interesting if we think of ourselves. If someone wanted to dig something up on us, would they be able to do it? Well, they can't on Daniel. In verse 5, after all this digging around, spying on him, they conclude, look, they won't be able to get it done. They won't be able to actually bring something against Daniel, quote, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. So now they know, look, we're looking for flaws and foibles. We can't find them. But actually, if we work his faith here, we can actually manipulate the situation here. Because I think his faith goes against Darius. We can work that one. So verses 6 to verses 9, you see the advisors. The setting is the court and the king's court, so to speak. The advisors come to Darius. Verse 7, they start out by twisting the truth, Because they say, all presidents of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, and the counselors, the governors. Not true. They haven't consulted Daniel on this. And he's actually played up the food chain. They haven't consulted him. All the presidents, all these people, all your advisors, king, have agreed that the king, you should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, and then there's this appeal to vanity, which we've seen before. In the last case we saw that was to Nebuchadnezzar, but this time it's to Darius. If anyone sets a prayer or petition to anyone except you, king, may accept you. For the next 30 days, they shall be cast in the den of lions. So they put this to Darius thinking, this is good for the kingdom. This is actually good. This is going to bode very well for you, Darius. This is good for the Medo-Persian Empire. In verse 9, we see Darius signs the document, has this instated into law that anyone who prays to a god or a person other than Darius will be executed, and that execution will be thrown the den of lions. Now let me just stop there for a moment, because the basic inference from that story, which is it's a subplot of the greater plot, is that Darius listens to his advisors, which only makes sense. Of course he would. He's hand-chosen these people to be around him. It's his inner circle who actually have different specialties, different focus areas. So he, of course, would listen to them when he's in a moment of need, and he listens to them here. But it does force us to ask a question for ourselves. And the question is, who are our advisors? Who are your advisors? Now, some might say, don't have any advisors. Not working in public policy. Don't work in that area. That's sort of a non-question for me. But the question is really, who is in your inner circle? What or who do you listen to for advice? That's a question worth pondering. We have so many voices that we can listen to. We can listen to CNN, we can listen to Fox, NPR, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, friends, spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend, mother, father, colleagues. We all have voices in our world that we can choose to listen to. But we don't have to. The question is, what voices are we listening to? In other words, what are the voices in our life that we say, yeah, that's legitimate, that's valid, I'm going to listen to that. And the question within that question is, are those voices wise? Do they build wisdom into our lives? Courage? Do they inspire us toward Jesus? That's a question worth pondering. Because what's interesting about this whole subplot, this sub-narrative with Darius and his advisors is they masquerade, they have it dressed up in clothes of his best interest. And it's not actually, they have a ploy, they have an ulterior motive. He's a day late and a dollar short in actually discovering that. But he gets there, but not in the moment. And it could have been catastrophic. Verse 10, we see Daniel hears about this. He hears of this new law, this document being signed. And what will he do? I mean, talking about catastrophe, that would have been a catastrophe. He knows. He knows the power, the force, the intimidation factor of lions. How will he do? How will he respond? What will he do? Well, we see actually, all we're given there is actually he prays. Not only he prays, the language there is he prays as his custom. He prays 3 times a day. In other words, it's sort of habitual for him, something he does 3 times a day. It's something built into his life, something that animates the way of being for Daniel. Why would he do that? Why would he pray 3 times? Well, we have different spaces we can go for this, different sources, not least the Psalms. The Psalms actually, at different points, talks about actually praying several times a day, meditating, for instance, Psalm 1, meditating on the law day and night. Psalm 55, we read evening and morning, and at noon I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. So it's not as though Daniel just came up with this method. It's something that is embedded into his life with God. Now, why does Daniel turn toward Jerusalem? He prays 3 times. Why does he turn toward Jerusalem? Well, there's a strong argument to be made here that this goes back to Solomon's dedication of the temple. So he's praying towards Jerusalem. That's where the temple was. What's sort of interesting at this point is the temple has been destroyed. And not only has it been destroyed, it's been destroyed by Babylonian power. So Daniel is praying toward the temple, but the temple has been destroyed. But the temple did signify where God's people were to come and worship him. Now listen to the dedication of the temple. This is from 1 Kings 8, verses 35 to 36. When the heavens, this is Solomon speaking at the dedication of the temple, when the heavens are shut up and there's no rain because your people have sinned against you, and when they pray toward this place and confess your name and turn from their sin because you have afflicted them, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel. Teach them the right way to live and send rain on the land you gave your people for an inheritance. Daniel prays, but when he prays, the direction in which he faces expresses a longing, a lament. You better believe there's sadness. He sees now his life is on the hook. There's a lament for what's happened to Judah, Jerusalem, the temple. But there's also hope. It's an embodied expression of hope that I can still trust in you. When I come to you, you hear me. God will hear Daniel's prayer. So Darius's advisors are spying on Daniel, and this is the spot where they catch him out. And they go back to the king, and they report to him that Daniel is clearly not following the law. And they have this, again, this language that is very good with twisting words, and they looked at the king and King, did you not put this law in place? Did you not put this law? I thought you put this law in place well, it's irrevocable, right? You can't take it back now. And by the way, one of your favorites, Daniel, well, he's not following the law that you put in place, so what are we going to do about that now, king? Well, Darius actually tries to do something about it. He tries to figure out ways to deliver Daniel, and he cannot. He cannot deliver Daniel, which that just adds one layer of complexity as to, hold on a second, he's the ruler. He can't change it. He made the law. Can he go back? Well, we're told he can't. It's irrevocable. Verse 16, Daniel is enthroned to the den. It's like a pit of lions. We are to imagine this pit that is built underground, but below ground level, that can be observed from above. And the king looks to Daniel and he says, may your God, whom you serve, deliver you. And that evening the king can't sleep, he can't eat, full of distress. Verse 19, when he wakes in the morning, he rushed to see Daniel and he says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, has he been able to deliver you from the lions? Verse 27, Daniel says, my God sent his angel and shut the mouths of lions. Such a high drama story. I mean, jam-packed full of drama, poignancy, and meaning. We come back to the central question. Let me just land, actually. We have to go to what Darius says, because Darius actually has this humongous line. When he sees all this, there was a reversal. Daniel is taken out of the lion's den, and then he does a switch. The people who actually were out conspiring against him, they are thrown into the lion's den with their families. And then Darius has this, he puts the decree, he reverses it, which also, that adds complexity there. And we're not going to get into the weeds, because I think if we were to get into the weeds of the stipulation of Babylonian and Medo-Persian law, I think some of us would rather go to the dentist than hear actually the stipulations of that law. So we won't get into the weeds of that, but it is to say that it's very complex, because all of a sudden he is able to change the law. And he does. He changes the law. He has this decree in which he says, all the peoples are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. And then he has this that follows the decree, it's almost as though he's giving a hymn, he's giving a psalm. He says, for he, that's Daniel's God, is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues, he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Pretty dramatic. And that's, it goes out in a flourish with that line from Darius. If God is involved in our world, how does he work? If God is involved in your world, in our lives, how does he work and where does he work? Fundamental to the book of Daniel is that God is involved. The question is, what does this story here tell us of the ways in which God works and the places in which God works? That's going to be very helpful. Because just like that guy that I started out with in this sermon, the guy who's at the pearly gates, if we aren't able to identify God working, then we're only a short distance from actually saying God isn't working. So the key is we've got to somehow discern and identify how God might be working in our lives, or we slowly get into the zone of saying, well, he's not really working. Are you with me? Does that make sense? I think it's huge. Okay, four pieces I want to leave with you here. So how is God working? What kind of places is he working? 1, he works powerfully. 2, he works mysteriously. 3, he works in dark places. And he works incognito. 4 pieces that are going to help us on this roadmap as we travel through Daniel 6. We see that he works powerfully. Daniel's God works powerfully. He works mysteriously. He works in dark places. And he works incognito. Powerfully, mysteriously, in dark places, incognito. He works powerfully. The book of Daniel orbits around this theme of power. And it's almost like every chapter, this question comes up for air. And the question is, who's really in charge? Who really holds the show together? Is it Nebuchadnezzar? Is it Belshazzar? Is it, in this case, is it Darius? And it's a constant question we are forced to ask. Who's really in control? Who has the power? And when Darius makes this grand pronouncement at the end of chapter 6, after seeing Daniel delivered, rescued, saved, it resembles, as I mentioned, a psalm. But it's worth sort of looking into that and saying, why does he use such language? It's almost hyperbole. Why would he go off on this very dramatic tangent saying all these things about Daniel's God? I want to suggest to you that one of the reasons why he goes into this and looking in how powerful Daniel's God is, he goes into this tangent because he actually knows power. He's actually the one set in charge under Cyrus of the Medo-Persian Empire. He's the one in power. Yet, as we see in this story, he realizes at a very physical level, his power is limited. He's trying to deliver Daniel, and he can't do it. But he's the guy. If anyone's going to be able to do it, he will be able to do it. Yet he cannot do it. His power is limited. So that's probably one reason where he says, I can't do it, but there's a God who actually can. So he sees power demonstrated, power that he is without. Adding to the distress that he faces in the nighttime was the known power, a power that Darius and Daniel both would have been familiar with, was the power of lions. In the ancient world, for instance, we are told just from history that kings would like to hunt lions for sport. Imagine that. Boy, that's man points there. I mean, you go, okay, I'll hunt some deer. No, you go hunt lion. Let's see how that works. I mean, those guys but in the ancient world, it had a mythological type of aura around it. You know, if kings would go out and hunt and take on a pride of lions, it had this mythological aura about it. Wow, that's strength. That's courage. And the reason why it had strength is because if you could take on lions, you were strong. Not only you were bold, it's like, well, you were strong. John Lennox puts it like this: the lion was a potent symbol of imperial power. So if you want to know power in the ancient world, the lion symbolized that. This is probably part of why Darius has this hymn at the end of Daniel 6 saying, wow, this God has delivered you, he's rescued you, because there's no, if you're sent to the den of lions, there's no good day with the lions. There's no like, they might not be hungry today. They might be in a good mood, and we'll just roll the dice. No, there's no good day with lions. Den of lions was, it was a death sentence. You were done. Yet Daniel lives. And then finally, Darius, in verses 20, verse 26, he makes a point in this hymn, in this psalm-like statement, of calling Daniel's God the living God. Why does he do that? I want to suggest to you, he mentions that Daniel's God is the living God because he actually is very familiar with gods that are not living. And he comes face to face at a very visceral level with a God who is living in a very demonstrable way, living. He knows all the gods of Babylon, of the Medo-Persian Empire, same of Babylonian power, of metal, of wood, of stone, shaped by human hands. And all of a sudden, he actually encounters a God who is living. Those are just a few reasons as to why he actually goes off on this very poetic hymn of Daniel's God. Now, it's just worth stopping there for a moment, because let's just work a pushback point. Some, I think like a skeptic, some might say, well, I'm not a polytheist. I'm not like any of those guys in Babylon or the Medo-Persian Empire. I don't have many gods in my life. I don't believe in many gods. I also don't believe in God. I don't really need God in my life. Let's work that one. Let's actually just go down that path for a minute. So there's a sense in which this story can be completely irrelevant. Darius's statement that can be irrelevant to us if we don't actually adhere to plurality of gods and also to God himself, which, by the way, is many in our culture and possibly in this room. And it's not only that I don't need God, it's actually I don't need God, and actually I'm perfectly happy. Now let's just work that for a minute, because it's worth exploring what do we mean when we say the word God. And we're not going to go down too far here because that's a mammoth question. But baseline understanding is, yes, okay, let's just work that. And I want to gently push back on that and say, God might not be for you Jesus Christ, but God is anything that takes the place of that thing. That could be Jesus Christ. The object to which we look to for hope, for peace, for meaning, for significance. So the question is not really, do we believe in God or not? The question is, we all have God, so to speak, in our life. It might be Jesus Christ, it might not be. But if you don't, you have something else that you're looking to for hope, for meaning, for peace, for salvation. The question really is, whoever that God is in your life, is he strong enough to save you? That's the question. Might not be metal, gold, wood. That might sound very ancient. It might not be Jesus even. But the question we all are forced to ask at some point is the question that meets us head on here. Is the God we have in our life strong enough to save us, to hold us? Is the God that you have in your life, is he strong enough to hold you? To save you, to rescue you, to deliver you? What we glean here from Darius, that statement, is actually only the living God we now know, revealed to us in Jesus Christ. Only that God is strong enough to do that. God works powerfully, and he also works mysteriously. Mysteriously. What does that mean? Well, in this story, we're reminded of the role that mystery plays in our faith. Now, let me just back up for a moment, because I think mysteries, for some of us, it really freaks us out. We sort of get like, oh, mystery, uh-oh. What are we talking about here now? And I remember speaking to, at a university years ago, and I was heckled. And as a speaker, trust me, you never forget when you've been heckled. You might need professional psychiatric care after that, but you definitely do not remember, you don't forget getting heckled. And I remember it was in a panel Q&A where actually someone asked a question about the nature of God, and I spoke at a certain point about mystery. And this person shouted in his seats in the lecture theater and said, "Oh, mystery, mystery, mystery. Oh, the whole thing's mystery. You guys, it's all mystery." And I actually said, "No, actually, you're seeing mystery as synonymous with being bogus. And that's not what we mean as Christians. It's actually worth understanding. When we speak of mystery in a theological sense, a very simple understanding is that what we mean is when we're studying God, there are things here that are very difficult to understand, but not irrational. Difficulty to understand something is not the same thing as irrationality. That's a very key principle, because there are things that we see, even in the nature of God, throughout the whole of Scripture, that we certainly see in this story, that are difficult to understand. And that is where we come upon the aspect of mystery in our faith. Just something that is difficult to understand. We can still trust, but we have to acknowledge there's some things that are very difficult to understand. That doesn't mean they're irrational. Why do I say that? Because it would be a false inference here to say that, oh, Daniel was rescued here, therefore we will always be rescued. Wrong. If that's the case, we wouldn't have Christianity today. To really drill down here, Jesus wasn't rescued. He was doing all the right things. He was following everything to the line to his Father. He wasn't rescued, so to speak. Peter and the many bastions of early Christianity, they weren't rescued, so to speak, in their moment. They were killed. The point is not to say, oh, look, all these bad things happen. Ultimately, we will all be rescued, so to speak. But not necessarily in the physical sense. In the eternal sense, we'll be rescued. That's why we have to actually hold this idea of mystery. It has to be part of the faith. Not mystery as in like the detective novel, like, oh, just stuff we don't know. As much as, no, we do know stuff, and that stuff that we do know has to illuminate the stuff that we don't know. We know a lot. God has revealed himself to us in Jesus. But there are things that we just have to say they're difficult to understand. There are a lot of things in this story that are difficult to understand. But difficulty to understand something is not the same thing as irrationality. Let me sort of give an example to this. One of my professors was a guy named Alistair McGrath, a very brilliant guy. He's a scientist and theologian, and he gave this example of the limitations of being human when it comes to faith and understanding God. And he used this analogy of like, supposing we wanted to see stars. It's like, look at stars and catch a glimpse of the Milky Way. This is what he wants. This is the picture he painted. He said, look, you can't do this during the day. That's a key point. If you want to see stars and the Milky Way, you can't do this during the day. You have to wait until it is dark. The stars are still there during the day. It's just that you cannot see them. Our eyes just aren't discerning enough to pick up their light during the day. So it is with God. Just as our eyes can't see stars during the day, so our minds can't take in the fullness of God. This is key here. It is the way we see things rather than the way things actually are, which is the problem here. That's very important. Because we actually we actually often will conclude, oh, because I can't see it, it's not happening. This is what he says again. Let me repeat that line. It is the way we see things rather than the way things actually are, which is the problem here. And he concludes, being human places limits on what we can see, know, and understand. This is part of why Paul used the language of we see through glass darkly. We actually see a lot, but there's stuff that we don't know. The stars are there. God is working. We might just not be able to see him, not because God's not there, but because the limits of just being human. He works powerfully. He works mysteriously. And he works in dark places. Where does God do his rescuing power in Daniel? When we see actually it happens for the three men, those three young guys in the fiery furnace. That's in their darkest hour. We see it here in Daniel 6. We see it when Daniel he is sent to the lions. He's not only sent, he's actually in the lion's den. He comes through it on the other way out. And the stories in Daniel actually have, like the contours of the story have echoes of Joseph in Genesis. How Joseph was sold by his brothers. People conspired against him. And in Genesis 50, Joseph says, "You intended to harm me. God intended it for good." And isn't it interesting when we think of Jesus, going back to Good Friday, we use that language of all the places on earth in that moment, at the cross, that was the most God-forsaken place. Perhaps not only on earth in that point, but actually ever throughout the history of humanity, the most God-forsaken place. Yet where was God? That's exactly where God was, in that God-forsaken place. God was actually working out his plan of salvation. If we are in a place today where we'd say, this is dark. This is not where I want to be right now. Don't want to be here right now. That is hugely encouraging because it tells us there are no ghettoized spaces for God. No places that are off limits. The darkest place, perhaps the darkest hour of our life, God actually can still work. He can still rescue. He can still redeem. He can still heal. He can still meet us in those places. God works in dark places, but fourth, he also works incognito. We know from this story, we know some details. We know how God works. We know that, there's an angel. Daniel says to Darius, there's an angel that has rescued him. This angel shut the mouths of lions. But there's also a lot that we are not told of how it all went down. And there is a sense in which God is working here sort of incognito. C.S. Lewis put it like this one time in his writings. He said, "We may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God. The world is crowded with him. He walks everywhere, incognito." The world is crowded with him. And again, it comes back to this point of mystery. Sometimes we just don't know. We don't see it, but that doesn't mean he's not there. In the scriptures, we have the details of how God works, but we don't always have the details. That doesn't mean he's not working. Psalm 77, this past week in our staff meeting, we meditated on part of Psalm 77. Let me read to you Psalm 77, starting in verse 12. The psalmist writes, "I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. You with your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen." In the Hebrew, it actually says your footprints were unknown. God is working in our lives. And sometimes we feel it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. But we have the assurance that he is working. Sometimes his footprints will just not be known. We won't see them. But that's not the same as him not working. God works powerfully. He works mysteriously. He works in dark places, and he works incognito. So let me land it here, because part of this is actually comes down to, okay, what do we need to know? Well, we need to know that part. This is how God works. Powerfully, mysteriously, in dark places, and incognito. Now, what do we do with all this? And the question we land with today is, how might we reflect something, at least, something of the courage and wisdom that Daniel embodied in that story? How are we to reflect that courage? Well, I want to suggest to you, it might start with something of what we saw in Daniel's praying. Practices. practices that inspire faith. Now, let me just stop for a moment, and because as I was thinking of this almost for some of us could be a non-starter, because if we're not even in a place that we're interested or have this love for Jesus, it's a non-starter for me to say, so build something in your schedule that you would push you towards Jesus, where it's like, I'm not even there yet. So let me just start here at sort of at a macro level. Years ago, not too long ago, but I watched this movie. I think some of you have probably watched it too, and it's called In Search of Greatness. And it profiles, great athletes. So Muhammad Ali is profiled, Pele, Jerry Rice, Wayne Gretzky, who is called the Great One himself, Michael Jordan, Serena Williams. But it profiles them to see what made them great. What was the makeup? And these guys, all these athletes there was something different about them. They were special in a way. It wasn't just their fortitude or their discipline. They were unique creatures in a way. But what was interesting is each one was asked about the kind of practices they had in place. What made, so I remember watching the interview that was done with Wayne Gretzky, this hockey player. And he said, I think for me is, because his brother also played in the NHL, and he said, look, my brother and I both liked hockey, but the thing is when my brother went out with his friends, I just went back to the backyard rink and I just kept playing hockey because I loved it. And the interviewer said, yeah, but you must have had practice. You must have had your dad must have really had you going full tilt, practicing all the time on the ice. And Gretzky said, not really, here and there, but I just loved the game. So I practiced a lot. Now I'm paraphrasing here, but the idea is for some of us who would say, I'm not there yet, I'm not in a space where I'd be like Daniel. Maybe a good prayer for some of us might be asking God to just rekindle a love for him this morning. And we combine that with a practice. A practice might just be praying for 15 minutes, listening to the scriptures for 15 minutes, maybe on an app, or reading the scriptures for 15 minutes. Something that fuels the fire of our faith. But the key here is not to think, okay, I'm going to climb Mount Everest now. Start where we are. Start where you are. The tendency is when I feel inspired, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to spend 2 hours now a day. Okay, hold on a second. Hey, let's actually just start where we are. That's where you start. Where you start where you are. And you build off of that. Could be 15 minutes. Could be actually, I don't have time right now. I don't have 15 minutes a day. Maybe it's in the commute. Maybe it's in that spot where ordinarily it's dead time. Maybe it's that where you say, I'm going to actually give that to Jesus now. I'm just going to take time to listen to him. I'm going to listen to the scripture. I'm going to read the scripture. I'm going to sing to him. Different ways in which all we're doing is paying more attention to Jesus. And it's fueling our love for him. But maybe, before we even get to the practices, it's actually saying, God, rekindle love. Because in a way, when you think of even, again, this search for greatness, all these athletes, it wasn't because they practiced. They had a genuine love for the game. And it was the combination of their love combined with the practices that actually made them great. How are we going to become people who exemplify something of a Daniel? It's not going to just be by practices. It's going to be by a love that God puts in us by his Spirit. And it's set ablaze by the practices we put in our lives that fuel that fire. Let's pray. Let's just take a moment to maybe respond here before we enter into communion. Whatever God might be saying to us, we can take this moment to respond to him. Lord, we look to this passage and there's so much to think of. And we think of Daniel, how in a sense he's so distant from us, almost not realistic. But the faithfulness that he had is something that you still call us to. And so I pray for each one here. And I ask the Lord, you would help us as people who feel as though we are wanting to live with strong faith in a strange land. Strengthen us. And for some of us who might be feeling a disconnect, we don't have the love. We don't have the love of God. At least we don't feel it. We're not experiencing it. In this moment now, hear our prayer, Lord. In your mercy, in your grace, hear our prayer. Fill us afresh, Lord, with a love for you. And give us your grace, give us your strength so that how we spend our days reflect that love and cultivate that love for you. God, what we're asking for a work of the Spirit of Jesus in us, the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, who dwells in us. Awaken a desire in us. Awaken in us a love for you. That love that Daniel had for you, that reached out to you in hope to trust you. Give us that love today. In your name.